All right. So yeah, so I just wanted to, like Don said, I was able to start as one of the first PhD students. And so I went and found a couple of pictures of us. There were 8 of us, like she mentioned. There were 5 PhD students, and we had three master students. And like Don mentioned, we didn't even know that robotics existed when we applied. So when we applied, it was approved after the fact, and so they went and found some of us and told us, hey, if you want to switch into robotics. And for me, I was thrilled to do that because I knew I wanted to do robotics, and then I knew that if I said yes, then I got in. so that was exciting for me. But anyway, it was great. So there was just a small group of us, and we got to kind of watch the program grow and hopefully help it grow, but definitely grow ourselves as it grew. For me, it was like a great learning experience. I learned a lot of things here. And so my wife and I kind of like to joke that we grew up in Ann Arbor because we 2 of our kids were born here. We had a lot of challenging things that taught us things about research and robotics, but also just faith and other things in our lives. So it was a great place to be. And I just want to say thank you to all the faculty who helped me over the years, right? So I think there were Ram as well as Natalia and others, Don, who helped me a lot, and all of you, some of you students who I knew when I was here. But yeah, okay. So I wanted to just jump in and talk about some of the things that we have been doing at BYU for the last 3 years. So I did a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon after I left here, and then I went to BYU for 3 years. I've been there about 3.5 since then. So at BYU, I run the field robotics lab, which is and so we do a lot of things with marine robotics. I want to kind of talk about what are the big problems that we are interested in marine robotics, and why we're kind of motivated in the things we're doing. Most of the work on these projects has been done by my students, obviously, right? And so I wanted to point out that I have a great set of students, and they're awesome. So, okay, let's jump into it. So the first big problem that we're interested in is looking at enabling robots to understand where they are underwater. And we're specifically interested in doing that with multiple different types of vehicles, as well as multiple different teams of agents and multiple different types of sensors. So this kind of started with a project that actually started here, right? So I did my PhD with Ryan Eustace doing autonomous ship hull inspection. And that project kind of started with MIT and Michigan, and now it's kind of a project between CMU and BYU. But a lot of what we did there was looking at how do you enable a robot to map the underside of a ship. So if you think about the current method for doing that is using divers, and that can take months or a year, or like not months. It could take hours or days to actually cover the entire surface, depending on what resolution and how turbid the water is. And so what some of the things we're interested in is how do you actually enable look at an underwater structure and be able to perform mapping in that space. So this is kind of a project that Ryan did when we first started, that I was on when I was here. But we looked at using teams of robots to automatically map a surface. And one of the things that's difficult underwater is you don't have any GPS, right? So as soon as you get 6 inches underwater, you don't have the ability to use that for localization anymore. And you want to be able to ensure that you've covered the entire structure. And so if you want to be able to ensure that you've covered the entire structure, you need to be able to have some estimate of your uncertainty. So we were performing SLAM with visual features as well as sonar features in order to perform this mapping. So we've now moved on from that, but we're now looking at larger scale. So let's say you have an entire harbor area that you need to be able to do mapping, right? And you need to be able to, maybe you have complex structures in that harbor as well as flat 2D area, and you have different types of agents, and you want to be able to use those to cover the space. And ideally, you want the user just to be able to give a high-level command, something like search and map this area, and find all of the targets within that space, right? And then you want the system to automatically divvy up the work between agents, have them cover that area. And so these are kind of torpedo-like vehicles, and they're typically equipped with a type of sensor it's called side scan. So side scan sends out sound horizontally to the vehicle, and then it builds up a waterfall plot of the surface. So you can kind of see right here what that image looks like. And that's one type of sensor data that you might have. But one of the drawbacks of these types of vehicles is they can only cover large areas. They have to be moving, and they can't navigate very easily around 3D structures. So you might then, once you find complex 3D structures, you might want to then send out other types of vehicles to be able to go cover those structures in with other types of sensors and more mobility. So you're able to actually navigate around those 3D structures and build 3D models. So another type of sensor that these types of vehicles have is imaging sonar. And so the imaging sonar is able to look in front of you and build a model of the object in front of you in space. But in order to perform this all in GPS denied type of situation, you might need to be able to localize one type of sonar to another. And so this is a cross-modality problem, right? So you have different sensors that are fundamentally different in terms of model and what they're doing. And you need to be able to localize from one image to another across that space. So this is a project we have with ONR that's starting to look at these things. So how do we use different teams of agents with different mobility capabilities and then different sensing mobilities and use that for localization and mapping. And then the ideal thing would be able to build a map after the fact with all of these vehicles combined, right? So how do you take the sensor data from all of these different systems and combine it into a single map? A similar project that we have going on, so I guess we've been able to collect data for that specifically. So we have 2 IVER underwater vehicles at BYU that are equipped with side scan. And we've been able to take those and collect data in reservoirs nearby campus. And then you can kind of see that here in this area here. Let's check, make sure you can see this area right here. This is like the side scan imagery. And then this is a hovering vehicle that we built that has a forward-looking sonar. So you can kind of see this cement block that's an anchor that actually it appears in both of those images. So, but they look fundamentally different, right? And in acoustics, the angles that you're dealing with and the perspective you see those from those images, the things that really stand out within those images are more the shadowing more than anything else. And so it's difficult to try and figure out how do you align these two. And it's kind of a combination between a learning and potentially a geometry problem, where you're trying to determine how do I localize this against objects of similar shape. So we're also trying to do the same thing with teams of agents. So if you have teams of robots that are trying to navigate in the underwater domain, one of the prevailing ideas is to use terrain-aided navigation. So if you have some idea of what the map of the seafloor looks like, you can try and compare what you're seeing with the sonar as you look at the seabed and compare that to the map to try and perform localization. And that's something that people have done for quite a bit of time. But what we're interested in doing is doing that with teams of agents. So now let's say you have a lot of low-cost agents, and maybe you have one agent that's really important and it needs to get where it's trying to go. And all of this is dependent on the shape of the terrain. So if the terrain is mostly flat, there might only be certain places in the environment that will actually give you any information. So what we're interested in is can we plan a path for a formation of vehicles so that they cross over the parts of the terrain that vary, and that you can in turn use that to improve the localization for all of the vehicles in the space. So in order to do that, then you need to both solve this terrain-aided navigation, this active planning problem.
I confirm it is actively going on right now.
Okay, can you guys hear? Let's see here. Okay, so I think it's unmuted here. Is it? Hopefully they can hear, but okay, sounds good. All right, so what we're trying to do is try and combine those two types of techniques. So now we need to be able to take teams of agents and have them localized with respect to each other, as well as pass information between agents. And that's difficult in the underwater domain because there's communication constraints, right? And so in the underwater domain, the prevailing way of trying to send data is using acoustics. And the amount of data you end up sending is just 100 bits or so per second. And only one vehicle can talk at once. So it's a really tricky problem. And we're trying to think about how do we use that information to enable teams of agents to pass enough information to constrain the other agents while sharing that communication link that's in the constrained way. So that general topic of trying to do multi-agent teaming and doing localization in the underwater environment is one of the big problems that we're interested in. So a second big problem we're interested in is intelligent autonomous science and marine monitoring. So this is a project that's in collaboration with a faculty member at BYU in the biology department. And Richard Gill, he's been working with the island Molokai in Hawaii for about a decade now. So Molokai is home to the largest fringing reef in the United States. And the native Hawaiian population that's there uses the reef for fishing and subsistence food. So it's a really important resource, but it's being damaged due to erosion and sedimentation. So the island has really tall mountains, and the land has been somewhat poorly managed. So because of that, when the rain falls, it brushes all of the dirt into the reef, and it's killing off the reef. And so what we're interested in is how do we try and solve this problem? Can we try and characterize where it's happening worst and how we can try and solve those types of resolve some of these things? So this is a picture of one of my PhD students, one of Rick's. And if you collect, you can try and go manually try and collect sample data, but it takes a lot of effort, right? It's a really difficult problem to solve. And it's time consuming and costly. So our thought was, why don't we use a robot to try and do this, right? So this is an autonomous surface vessel that we took, and we added stereo cameras, RTK GPS, and water quality sensors too. And we went and mapped 5 different sites off the coast of Molokai in 2021. So here's some results from that. So you can see we've got 5 different sites that are about 50 meters by 30 or 40 meters long. And we built 3D reconstructions of those sites. So if you zoom in with on the side, you can see that from the lower image right here, you can actually see individual coral heads within those models. So the nice thing about this is it lets you go back to those same sites at later points in time, and you can map the exact same location, right? And you can track the actual growth of individual coral heads or the change across time. We've since gone back and done the same thing with a better surface vessel and underwater vehicles now. So we went off to the coast of Oahu. BYU is based in Provo, but there's BYU Hawaii that's based in Laie. And we've worked with some of the marine biologists there to be able to map coral reefs at 9 different sites across the coast there. And so here's like an example of a shipwreck that we mapped at the same time. You can see camera imagery as well as side scan, and then the 3D reconstruction from that imagery. And then we've done the same thing with various coral sites. So you can see the actual coral sites, the 3D reconstructions, and then side scan overlapping data there. So this is something we've been excited about. We've made a lot of progress, but you can start to ask some questions about this. So is this really autonomous data collection, right? It is autonomous, but it's not really that intelligent, right? The ways that we're doing this is we plan a pre-map trajectory, and the vehicle follows that no matter what, right? It does have a sensor that you can use to be able to avoid object in front of you. So if there's an object in front of you, you'll try and surface. But that it's not really that intelligent, right? It's helpful to cover large areas and to map a certain area, but the vehicle isn't really using that much knowledge or understanding of the environment. So what we want to be able to do is get to the point where we're changing the paradigm of how this works. And we want to imbue these vehicles with intelligent perception, intelligent reasoning, intelligent planning, right? We want them to be able to understand what they're looking for and how to go solve those types of problems, and collect the data that's most useful for the scientists. So that's problem number 2. The other third problem that we're really excited about is civil infrastructure. So the American Society of Civil Engineers gives a report card for America's infrastructure every year. And in 2021, it was a C-. It's still about that same point now.
But it went up from a D+.
Yes. Yep. So it's still pretty bad. And hopefully we were able to resolve some of those things because there's been more recent interest in it. But if you look at that report card in more detail, we have 91,000 dams in the United States. And over the last 20 years, the number of high hazard dams has doubled. And so that means that we have 2,300 high deficient dams that have high hazard potential. So what that means is that high hazard potential means that if they failed, they would flood cities and hurt people, right? And we have 2,300 that are deficient, right? And so that's a big problem. And it really affects people's lives. And that's just dams, right? So there's 617,000 bridges, 300 plus ports, 12,000 miles of inland waterways, and 30,000 miles of levees, right? And if those fail, same thing happens. You get flooding, you get resources destroyed, and people's lives potentially. So this kind of ties back into the ship hull inspection that we talked about before, right? But the way that this is currently inspected and dealt with is through the use of divers. And that's dangerous, costly, time consuming, and tedious, right? So to dive, you have to dive in buddies. And you can dive for about 45 minutes before your air runs out. And then you have to go back to the surface and wait several hours before you're allowed to dive again. So in order to cover a dam or a large structure will take potentially weeks, right? And so this is really dangerous, and this results in us having less frequent inspections than what we actually should have, right? And when we do the inspections, they also don't know where they are. So the way that they collect data is they just take pictures with a camera and then they write up a PDF when they get back, right? So it's really hard to try and track this information over time. So you can think of a situation instead where you have teams of agents that are automatically doing inspection of these structures, right? Where they can build a 3D model, they can track things over time, they know where they are, and you can increase frequency and decrease cost. So those are some of the big problems in marine space that make us excited and that we're interested in working on. So now I want to talk a little bit about what makes this challenging, and then I'll jump into some of the tools that we've developed to try and decrease some of that challenge. And then at the end, I'll talk about some recent work that's moving towards intelligent marine robotic autonomy. So in terms of underwater autonomy challenges, so Katie probably knows about these, but like there's logistical issues that make it challenging, first of all, right? So you're dealing with the underwater environment, which means you have to deal with pressure, you have to deal with salt water, right? And if things leak, then you get fried electronics, right? And so things that you spent a lot of time trying to make work can fail really easily if you're not careful. Then there's operations and mission logistics. So you actually have to get out there and make sure that people don't run over your robot, right? Or that you're planning missions in the right way. And then there's safety for the people and the robot as well. But then if you actually get into the autonomy, it's a GPS denied environment inherently, right? So you don't have GPS as soon as you dive. It's really difficult to provide ground truth. So if you're trying to solve the localization problem, you need a way of proving that your method's going to work. And that in and of itself is challenging. You can use common sensors like camera, but they have their own challenges underwater. So there's low visibility. You typically get 2 to 3 meters of vision if you're lucky, right? There's low light conditions. The feature poor, there's a lot of backscatter that can cause your images to be blurry. And then you get color attenuation. And another thing that's really difficult is that you have to focus the cameras, and the focus is going to be dependent on depth. And every time you try and adjust the focus, you have to reopen the enclosure that's trying to store the vehicle. So there's a lot of different challenges that come into using camera. So because of that, we often use sonar instead. But sonar has its own set of challenges as well, right? So sonar imagery is noisy. It's typically you can do passive or active, but typically when we're trying to use it for perception, it's active. So you send out sound, that sound bounces off of objects. And then when the sound comes back, you can use beamforming to get one of the angles. And then you can also try and get range from time of flight. But you lose some of the information in the vertical. So it's a 3D to 2D projection, but it's projecting in the polar space as opposed to the Euclidean space. So it's similar to a camera in the sense that you lose some information, but the projection is more complex. You also multipath. It's non-intuitive for us to look at and really understand what's happening. You can have ambiguity. And then in terms of simulation, right, there's a lot of robotic simulators out there, but none of them really support all of the different types of sonar or underwater sensors that you need. And then there's just all of these things kind of lead to a general lack of data, right? So we're kind of in the age of big data, and there's lots of methods and now learning methods that you can use to try and solve these problems. But it's really hard to get data underwater, right? So collecting data in robotics is hard, but collecting robotics data underwater is even harder, right? Because you now have to deal with all of those things we talked about before, and field tests are costly, right? And so you typically have to ship vehicles to the site and charter a boat per day, and then travel, and then pay insurance and everything else. And so it ends up being even more difficult. And then once you get there, the robots are costly, and you don't want to lose them. And so you're kind of risk averse in terms of actually running the experiments, because it's better that you don't lose the vehicle than that you don't get any data, right? And so that makes it even more challenging. So these lead to like limited amounts of data, a limited a priori knowledge of the environment. So every time you go, you don't really have intuition of what you're going to see because you aren't there as often as we are every day. And then that makes training on large data sets almost impossible. So all of these challenges make it really difficult. And we wanted to get to the point where we could try and lower some of those barriers, right? And so also I started in 2020 at BYU. And so everything was remote and we didn't have students who could go like get robots up and running at the beginning either. So one of the first things we started to think about was how do we simulate to try and get this data? And so we built a simulator called Hollow Ocean that was published in ICRA last year. And I'm going to talk about that here for a bit as well. And our hope with this simulator is really to try and get it to the point where it's easy for anyone to get involved in marine robotics. So we started looking with a literature review, what are the existing simulators that were out there. Some of these are kind of integrated into Gazebo as well as other places, but none of them really had the capabilities we wanted. So like I mentioned, there's lots of different types of sonar and almost no simulators actually incorporated sonar. And if they did, it wasn't all of the different types that we were interested in. We also are working with multi-agent systems, right? So we're working with teams of agents, and in order to do cooperative localization, we needed teams of agents to be able to talk to each other with the similar type of constraints that you have in an underwater environment. And none of those simulators simulated acoustic comms or optical comms. And then ideally, we wanted something that was open source, had a small number of dependencies, and was easy to use. So we ended up building our own because we couldn't find one that was out there. We called it Hollow Ocean because it's based on an existing simulator called HoloDeck that was also developed at BYU. HoloDeck was primarily a reinforcement learning simulator in air, but we went and added underwater autonomous vehicles. We also added sonar, multiple different types of sonar, acoustic optical comms, multi-agent system simulation, common underwater sensors, and a variety of existing environments. So it's all based on Unreal Engine 4, which lets you use all of the high fidelity imagery generation properties that come with the game engine. And then we wrap the whole thing in a simple Python interface. So you can actually access, get things up and running in just 5 or 6 lines of Python code, just by specifying what type of sensor you want and what environment you want to run in. So one of the first things we had to think about here, and this was work by Easton, who was a master's student of mine, we had to figure out how we wanted to actually simulate the sonar in an efficient way. So I mentioned this before, but sonar is a 3D to 2D projection, but it happens in polar space, right? So you send out active sound, it bounces off of objects. Then when it comes back, that sound, you can measure range from that. And then if you perform beamforming, you can get one of the angles with an array, with a 1D array. There are sonars that have a 3D array or like a 2D array, so you can try and get the other angle, but they're typically hundreds of thousands of dollars for those sensors. So the tricky thing here is that you lose information in a vertical arc. So everything on a vertical arc in 3D gets projected into a single pixel in the image. So it makes it much more complicated than a single ray, like you would typically think of for a camera. So what we chose to do here is break the environment into an octree representation. And then at each cell within the octree, we store the position and normal of the robot pose or of that point. And then we can use the octree representation to really efficiently find what's in the field of view. And then we can reproject that back into the sonar efficiently using the projection model I just described. So this gives us a way of simulating sonar imagery. So we can simulate, this is an example image sonar an imaging sonar being simulated here as the robot navigates through a couple different environments. Okay. So we've also added a variety of other sensors, all the types of sensors that you would need to do navigation or perception work in the underwater environment. So we've added an IMU, a Doppler velocity log, which is a really common underwater navigation sensor, pressure sensors, and then based on Unreal, we can use optical cameras, and then we've added GPS sensors and pose sensors as well. So you can really easily just collect the data you want almost instantaneously. And then we've also added the ability to simulate acoustic comms and optical comms, which are the two primary ways of communicating underwater. So you can use line of sight and so, for example, when you try and perform acoustic comms, you need to be in range and also have line of sight. And so we'll check for that automatically and ensure that you can actually see the vehicle. That's an approximation because on the underwater environment, sound doesn't actually travel straight. It actually bounces around depending on temperature and different parts of the water. But this gives us a place to start. And then we also do optical communications as well. So you can, for optical comms, you actually flash a light at each other underwater, and you can send much higher rates of data that way, but you have a much smaller range, and you have to be focused and actually center down the object. And so we check for visibility within a cone of optical for optical comms. And that led to a paper that was looking at just starting to look at how do you plan trajectories for vehicles so that they can maintain communication as they navigate around objects underwater. And then we've built a variety of custom environments. So we've got a pier, an open ocean, and a dam environment built in to start. And so that you can, using Unreal Engine 4, you can create your own environments, or you can use the ones that we've actually already built. And then it's really easy to use. Like you can just install it with pip install Hollow Ocean. And then within 6 or 7 lines of code, you can be up and running to be able to be collecting data. Okay, so that was the first paper that we published on this. And so the second, we followed it up with a publication in IROS the same year that was looking at how do we extend this to a variety of other types of sonar, right? So I already talked about imaging sonar, but we have these other types of sonar that also exist underwater. And we also wanted to improve the noise reality of the actual image. So one of the first things we noticed was that there's a lot of missing noise, right? So on the left here, you can see a real sonar image. It was collected of our test tank at BYU. And then on the right, you can see a simulated sonar image of the same test tank. So there's, first of all, a general lack of noise. The lines are too crisp. There's artifacts in the real image from beamforming, but then there's also multipath, right? So there's actual structures that show up in the real world image that don't even exist in reality. And so we wanted to try and add some of these things to try and improve the fidelity of the simulation. And the first thing we had to do was multipath. So multipath is really expensive because it requires ray tracing every ray from the sonar across every object in the field of view and then back into the sonar. And so we developed a method that's an approximation, but it lets us cluster the environment and so that we can do this more efficiently. So we cluster the environment that falls within the field of view, then take the central point within that cluster and extract its normal and reflection direction. And then from that, we can ray trace along that reflection direction. And if we hit another structure within the field of view, then we can approximate it as being linear. And then it just becomes an affine transformation to reproject all of the entire cluster back into the sonar frame. So it lets us solve this much more efficiently. And we implemented that as well as a variety of other types of noise. So I won't go through all of them, but we were able to incorporate multipath as well as diffusion and a variety of others. And so we end up with a simulated image now that's much similar to reality, right? It's still not perfect. There's still a sim to real gap there, but it's much closer than it would be otherwise. Okay, we took the same method and we simulated it, applied it to the other types of sonar that exist as well. So side scan sonar is a type of sonar where the vehicle now sends out sound horizontally from the vehicle, and then it just measures the time of flight to return. And so everything gets projected onto a single range axis. And then that becomes those intensities become one line within this plot. So you kind of build up a waterfall plot as the vehicle moves, and you can build up a high fidelity 2D image of the seafloor, right? And so we applied the same techniques to side scan. We were also able to apply the same techniques to profiling multi-beam sonar, which is what is used to map the depth of the seafloor. So as the vehicle moves through, this works the same as imaging, except that the aperture angle is much smaller. And then the typical kind of echo sounder that you might have on like a fish finder or something like that on your boat that's trying to determine your depth. But it's the same concept. It's just now in a cone shape as opposed to a push through. So we implemented each of those, and that was all published in in IROS last year. So all of this is online. You can get access to the documentation just by going to that QR code. Or if you just search All Ocean, it'll pop up. And our hope is to be able to enable the simulator to be used for anyone who's interested in marine robotics, right? So we want to get it to the point where it's useful for lots of people and incorporate all the different features that we can. And it sounds like there's a lot of interest. So we've got people all over the world that are using it now. ONR is interested in specifically funding development on this specifically. So it sounds like there's a lot of interest picking up for it. Okay, so that's one of the tools that we've built. We've also started to look at some other tools as we've moved towards these other goals that we have. I don't have as much time to talk about these, so I just want to jump in and touch on them briefly. But I mentioned before that we need to be able to do ground truthing, right? So we want to be able to develop localization algorithms for these systems, and we need a way of evaluating if they're correct. And so the way that that's done for SLAM a lot of the time, if you don't have GPS in air, is through fiducial markers, right? So if you have able tags or something like that, you can use those to be able to guarantee that you've come back to the same location and then calculate some form of error on your pose estimate. So the problem is that camera doesn't work very far underwater in turbid environments, and able tags are invisible in sonar, right? And so we've developed another fiducial marker called AC tag, that's based on able tags. So it has a subset of the same families as able tags. So you can actually detect it using able tags algorithm in camera. But you can also, we've developed an algorithm that you can detect it in sonar as well. So that it's basically built out of foam and metal so that they have different reflective properties and acoustics. But you can use the same algorithm to be able to detect it both in camera as well as in sonar. So that's actually going to be presented in IROS here in a week. But that's one thing we've been working on. And then we've also developed a method for localization in underwater environments that utilizes the group structure. So there's something called the invariant extended column filter that basically lets you model your noise in the Lie algebra, which handles the nonlinearities of the problem in a much nicer way. And so we've extended that to use for underwater navigation. So we've taken the common type of sensors that you would have when doing underwater navigation, so DVL, IMU, and depth sensors, and worked out how you would integrate those into an invariant column filter. And there's some tricky things that we had to do there because we're dealing with scalars in some cases and some tricky things there. But that's work that was published in RAL, and it's also released online as well. Okay, so those are some of the tools that we've built to try and work towards solving these problems. So now I want to talk about what we're really interested in terms of getting towards intelligent robotic systems in marine environments. So one of the things I mentioned before was that we want to have robots that understand what the scientist is wanting them to find, right? And so because there's a lack of data in underwater environments, it's tricky to be able to collect enough data that actually covers the space of things you want to observe. But the robot needs to have some idea of what it's observing so that it can try and model and ideally change its trajectory to focus on what actually matters. So the existing methods that have been developed out there try to use what's called visual topic modeling to automatically extract a topic from existing a stream of imagery. So as the robot's moving through the environment, it's trying to automatically split what it's seeing up into topics, so then it can try and focus on either topics that are important or things that are surprising in the space. One of the tricky things that happens here, though, is because it's an unsupervised method, those techniques don't, the topics that are learned might not directly apply or map to what the scientist is interested in. They're just inferred topics based on the statistics of when specific features appear nearby other features. So we've developed a method that does semi-supervised learning to try and incorporate labels from a scientist into this topic modeling space. So the goal here is to have the scientist just map, maybe label 4 or 5 images and say, these are the things I'm interested in, and these are the things that I'm not interested in, right? So maybe you have 2 topics, one that's coral and one that's not coral. And then gets embedded into a prior called a visual Dershowitz Lake forest, that comes from natural language processing. And you use that to try and ensure that the topics you're inferring actually match to what the scientist is interested in. And so here's like a video of that running here. So you'll see that this image in the top left is the original data. This is the GRF, which is the existing method, and this is ours here in the bottom. And you can then see a temporal plot here on the bottom left that actually is correlating from one image to another. So it tells you how much of the image corresponds to one topic versus the other. And you can tell this one was labeled specifically so that one topic should correspond to coral, while one should correspond to everything else. And you can see from when this pauses that the GGRF, which we call the guided Gaussian random forest, better matches this, right? So it allows us to be able to better match what we're actually trying to look for, while the existing method kind of just learns how things match against each other in terms of statistical inference. So that's one thing we've been working on. Another thing we're working towards is using semantic mapping, right? So we want to be able to have vehicles that are operating at the surface, understand what they're seeing, and be able to then do intelligent work, right? So we want them to be able to understand how to navigate around specific types of obstacles or localize against coasts, things like that. So there's a variety of things that we've been doing towards developing semantic mapping, and that's an area that we're just starting up on here in the next little bit. And then we're continuing to also improve Hollow Ocean, right? So we're interested in incorporating semantic labeling. We're working with some other, so I think John Leonard's lab at MIT has been working on using Hollow Ocean to incorporate currents. So they want to be able to drop vehicles into the water and then have them be pulled around by the currents. So we're trying to integrate some methods like that. We want to improve the physics simulation. And then ideally, we want to be able to get to the point where we have teams of agents that are collecting data of real locations and then use that to generate simulated environments of the real space, right? So that gives us the ability to simulate kind of a digital twin environment where you're actually running simulation in an analog environment to a real location. And then we're interested in just working with people in general to incorporate whatever features they might be interested in as we try and keep Hollow Ocean going and improve it. Okay, I think that's most of what I have. I'm happy to answer questions. But I'm especially thankful for my students, right? Who did most of the work, obviously, in this talk. So thanks.